Hello and welcome to The Wrap, WRAL's politics podcast. I am Will Doran, and I'm here with my colleague Brian Murphy, and we are going to tell everyone about this past week in politics. It was a big one. The state legislature is back in session for the 2024 short session, and they're saying it's going to be short this time. They've said that the last 10 times, and they've been wrong every time, so we will see if they are right this time. But the word on the street is they want to get out of town by the 4th of July.
That would be good news for everyone, I think. The best news that they're back is for, I think, the cafeteria workers and the snack bar workers there. We kept them in business here the last couple of days.
Yes, they were packed down there. And, it's the cheapest lunch in downtown Raleigh. A little insider tip for people who don't know.
Yeah.
Because they're open to the public, the snack bar down in the basement there. If you want a good $4 or $5 hamburger, check it out.
Far too many chicken tenders in my future.
But let's talk politics instead of snacks. So next week we're going to see the big immigration bill come up, and this is the bill that passed in 2022. Governor Cooper vetoed it then. It's coming back up now. It is forcing sheriffs to work with ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement federal officials. And we have 100 sheriffs in North Carolina. 90 or more of them work with ICE already, but there's a handful of holdouts, mostly the Democratic sheriffs in the larger urban counties, who say, we have constitutional concerns with ICE asking us to hold people after they've been ordered to be let out of jail. And we also think that it hurts our, ability to work with the local Hispanic community if we're, working with the federales. And so they would rather not. And the legislature says, no, it shouldn't be up to you. We're going to force you to do this. And it looks like while this did fail in 2022 when Roy Cooper vetoed it, it's going to happen this year. Cooper does not have really a veto anymore. Republicans have a veto-proof supermajority, and this will pass once the Senate gets around to doing it, which could happen as soon as next week or two.
It's one of the few things that state lawmakers can do to deal with immigration, which they, has come up in WRAL polls as a top issue, particularly for Republican primary voters, which, obviously a lot of Republicans in the legislature. I think they also have concerns about space. Where are you going to hold people who have already been released, and how much money you're going to get from the feds to do that. But as you said, this is going to happen. What's interesting is that many of these sheriffs, the ones who are against this, were elected. They ran on strictly, we're not going to work with ICE as their platform. And then they were elected. And now the state government, as it is wont to do, is stepping over that local control and saying, no, you're going to have to work with ICE.
Yes, we've seen many examples in recent years of the state legislature overriding local government decisions, which is probably a political debate for another day, but it is an interesting trend that has been going on for years. But obviously immigration is not the main point of the short session. The main point is the state budget. And they got some good news. There is a more than $1 billion budget surplus that they're going to have to figure out how to divvy up. There's going to be a ton of competition for that money. There's a handful of programs that are hundreds of millions of dollars short. We've been hearing from lawmakers. Medicaid is projecting to be pretty short. The Opportunity Scholarship Program, which is private school vouchers, is going to be short by another few $100 million. If they want to give extra raises or bonuses to state workers, that's going to take some money. Roy Cooper rolled out his own budget proposal. Brian, you were there for that. Take us through the highlights of what the governor's proposing.
Yeah, the governor really tried to draw a contrast with Republicans in the state legislature, basically saying, hey, we need to stop subsidizing wealthy families is basically the gist of it. We need to stop cutting taxes for the wealthiest North Carolinians, stop cutting corporate taxes, and stop, the way he put it, choking public schools by diverting some of that revenue or some of that money to private school vouchers. The Opportunity Scholarship, which Republicans have said they're going to fund the $300 million shortfall in that. The families that haven't gotten it are already sending their children to private schools, and they're not getting any rebate or scholarship or voucher, whatever word you want to use, to do that. And so Cooper tried to draw that contrast and say, you were giving people money to encourage them to do something they're already doing. Why we don't need to do that. And he set it up as, let's take this money, invest in teachers. He said that the state is 49th in the nation in beginner teacher pay. There's some debate, as to exactly where North Carolina stands, but raises for state workers. He also talked about childcare, and I think is going to be a big issue in this session. We're hearing it from Republicans like the Chamber of Commerce, basically saying, it's a hindrance on business. Childcare is not just an issue of where you're going to send your child for daycare and things like that. It's also a hindrance for workers who either have to drop out of the workforce or possibly take fewer hours, or maybe not be able to move to a new place to work a job because they can't find childcare. And so in Cooper's budget, he wanted to increase one more year of fully funding these stabilization grants. They've been paid for by the federal government previously. That funding is about to run out, and he wanted to use some state money to keep that program going for one more year. Yeah,
and so the subtext there, which you just brought up, is the state has always gotten some federal money for child care program, but kind of just, to stabilize, just extra money for these programs, because the employees are paid pretty low, and it's hard to keep people on board. So the feds have thrown in some money to help, just make it easier to run this business. That spending ballooned during COVID and went up from $400 million a year coming into North Carolina to $1.3 billion a year coming in. So almost an extra $1 billion. But that COVID era funding is ending in July with the new fiscal year. And so unless the state steps in, a lot of childcare businesses have said that they're going to have to shut their doors. I mean, we've been reporting on this for months. It's a huge issue all across the state. I mean, if my kid's daycare shuts down, you will not be hearing my voice on this podcast anymore.
Yeah, I mean, we're in the same boat. We both have young children, and some of them attend daycares or childcare centers that allow us to work. And this is a problem, I think, for North Carolinians, across the state. This is a common concern, no matter your political affiliation or your job status or any of that. Everyone has childcare concerns.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, it is a key concern of the Chamber of Commerce, which is, of course, a very powerful conservative business lobby. They're really pushing for this, and some other changes on the policy side as well for childcare to help them out. Governor Cooper proposed $750 million in his budget. That's more than half of the total surplus that North Carolina has. I don't know that Republican leadership is going to want to spend that much, but I think everyone expects that there will be some funding. We're going to have to wait and see.
And Cooper couched all this stuff as we can't be proudly touting that North Carolina is first in business by all these rankings. And he said, both me and the state legislature like to take credit for that, which is true. Both of them like to take credit for it. But he said we cannot be first in first in business if we're last in education. I think the Republicans would take some, objection to that. But I think a lot of his priorities were based on that. That what he says is businesses come to him and say, we need educated workers. We need, when we want to hire employees, they need to have confidence in the school system that they're going to send their kids to. They also need to have confidence in the childcare system that they may need to access in order to come to work. And so he kind of couched this as, he tried to spin it as a business thing, that if we're going to continue to attract businesses, we've got to have an educated workforce, and we've got to have childcare possibilities. And so I don't know if that will gain any traction, but at least it's a different pitch than maybe other Democrats would make.
Yeah, and we should note the legislature is controlled by Republicans. Cooper is a Democrat. His ideas are not going to be received very fondly at the legislature. But we asked Senate Leader Phil Berger about this on Wednesday when the session kicked off, and he said that he hadn't read Cooper's budget yet, which he has little interest in it. But reporters kind of gave him some of the highlights that we've just been talking about here, a few other things, and he said, well, there are a few things in there it sounds like we could work with. Most of it, no.
Right.
But there's maybe some bipartisanship.
Also, I talked to some people who described this Cooper budget as maybe the most political budget that he's done, which makes sense. He's lost the power of the veto. He's also lost the power of the office. I mean, he's a lame duck. He's going to be out of office. The campaign season is about to be underway. Come January, he won't be the governor anymore. And so this kind of his last chance to kind of make a stand. We've heard all along that public education was going to be his issue here. Now that he's got Medicaid expansion passed, for the final year of his term, he was going to make public education the focal point of pretty much everything he does. And this is a budget that does that.
Yeah, I think what you're going to see a lot from Democrats during the session, both in the legislature and from the governor, is just political posturing. Telling voters, hey, if you elect a Democrat to replace Roy Cooper as governor, if you help Democrats break this Republican supermajority, here are some of the things that we could get done. And you're going to see, of course, the opposite from Republicans. That's reflected in the immigration bill that they're bringing up. I'm sure there's going to be more. telling their voters, hey, these are the things we care about, and this is why you need to, keep voting to keep us in power here in the legislature, put a Republican in the governor's office. So a lot of this is going to be very political as the short session goes on. Let's take a quick break and talk about some of the things that are going to come up in the short session, maybe some medical marijuana. We heard some interesting comments about college athletics from Senate Leader Phil Berger, and of course, there are things happening in politics outside of the legislature. So we'll get into all that after this quick break. All right, welcome back to The Wrap. I am Will Doran, and I am here with Brian Murphy, and we're talking about the legislative short session. We talked about the budget. Medical marijuana, I think, could have some chances this year. Now, I've said that the last couple of years. It's passed the Senate 2 years in a row now with broad bipartisan support. The lead sponsor on this medical marijuana bill is Bill Rabin, who is actually one of the most powerful Republican lawmakers in the entire state. And he's really pushing for it, using his own personal story as a cancer survivor, an illicit user of marijuana while he was on chemotherapy, he's said publicly, to really push for this and say, look, most other states have done this. We need to get with the times, help people. The bill is called the Compassionate Care Act, and that's kind of the pitch that he's making. And it's written to be very strict. You hear other states, people go to the doctor and they say, oh, my back hurts. I need medical marijuana. That's not going to be allowed here in North Carolina. You can't say that you have glaucoma or things like that, or that you're struggling with opioid addiction, and so you need medical marijuana. None of those things are going to be on the list. It's written to be very, very strict, and that's to be able to get enough Republican votes to pass. The House has killed it the last couple of years, but the House is also trying to do some more to further regulate the hemp industry, stuff like you see in the gas stations like Delta 8, Delta 9, things like that are just totally unregulated. The Senate has not really wanted to do anything with that, so there's some talk that, hey, maybe we can come to an agreement here. We'll agree to pass your bill, you pass ours.
Some horse trading.
Right, yeah.
A couple of things on that. One, how much of that becomes an election year issue? Do you want to get tied to being someone who passed medical marijuana? That might be good in some races, might be bad in other races. And then also the Cherokee in the Western North Carolina have legalized medical marijuana, and I think they're going to start dispensing, if they haven't started already, very soon, perhaps on 420. And so, how does that change the dynamics of all this? I think we've seen with gambling in some ways, well, hey, it's already here. It's already at the Cherokee and already at the Catawba, and Virginia's doing it and Tennessee's doing it. That does, at least on some issues, has moved lawmakers in the past.
Yeah. Well, and, some other topics I think we could see come up, homeowners associations, those are unpopular with many people, and there has been a push to kind of crack down on their power and give homeowners more rights. We could see, some action on guns. That's probably unlikely, especially in an election year where there are a handful of competitive seats that both parties are a little nervous about. So I don't know if we'll see much on guns, but that's a possibility. But you just brought up gambling. I think that is going to be another big topic of this short session, especially video lottery terminals, VLTs.
Yeah, this was part of the package last year with casinos, and that, obviously that all fell apart. Now that sports gambling is up and running, some Republicans have talked about wanting to regulate video lottery terminals. They've tried for years to make them illegal. They are illegal, but there are lots of places where you can go and play on these machines. The state's obviously not collecting any money off of that. There is this funding cliff that people are talking about, and this would be a big way of filling that. Some have said up to $1 billion a year could come to the state. We're talking about maybe $100 million from sports gambling. So $1 billion would be a huge step. But interestingly, the governor in his 2-year budget proposal last year included about $243 million in revenue from VLTs in that budget, indicating he thought it might pass or supported it. He did not put that in his budget adjustment. He just removed that line completely, and he said after the passage of sports gambling, this is a statement from his spokesperson that I got, after the passage of sports gambling, he doesn't see an appetite among legislators to pass VLTs. Well, that comes as quite a surprise, since Republicans have been saying there is an appetite in the legislature to pass VLTs. So again, everything's political, but I could see this moving. There certainly seems to be a lot of lobbyist backing or many lobbyists working on the issue. And, Tim Moore, House Speaker Tim Moore, has kind of brought it up as one of the things they could get done. And he's usually somewhat careful with his words.
Yeah, well, and I mean, for years, people in this video gaming industry have been massive political donors to all of the right people at the legislature. I mean, we're talking tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing into some political campaigns. And, you don't give that money year after year after year after year if you don't expect to see some sort of movement. So
yeah, and maybe the time is ripe now that sports gambling has happened. It's very much you're not forced to do it. That's the line I keep getting from everyone. Well, it's a self-selecting thing. If you want to bet on sports, if you want to play video lottery terminals, these are not things that we're not raising everyone's taxes. We're not forcing you to pay into this. We're not forcing you to do it. But if you want to spend your entertainment dollars that way, feel free.
Yeah. Well, speaking of sports betting and college sports, we also spoke with Senator Berger about the future of the ACC. And you and I were talking about this offline, and we weren't entirely sure how to interpret his comments, but basically talking about, okay, so what should happen if the ACC fails? Is the legislature going to step in to kind of dictate how the North Carolina schools scatter into these new conferences? And he said that he wanted to keep some schools together.
Yeah, he said he said if whatever, he wants to keep the ACC whole is basically what he said.
Sure.
And if that were unable to happen, then he would like to see North Carolina and North Carolina State stay together, and would also be happy if the Big Four, including Duke and Wake Forest, were to be able to stay together as well. This issue, I think, is going to become more and more of a political issue, not necessarily along partisan lines, but what can the state do, if anything, to these athletic programs? I mean, the ACC faces lawsuits from both Florida State and Clemson. The Florida State government, including the AG, is getting very involved in the case. So far, no one from North Carolina has gotten involved in the case, but we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. The ACC is holding most of its championships in the state. We know what the ACC basketball tournament means to the state. The ACC football championship is in Charlotte every year. If the ACC suddenly goes the way of the Pac-12, which no longer exists, that's going to be a big economic hit for the state. That's separate from what happens to UNC, what happens to NC State, what happens to Duke and Wake Forest, which aren't public schools, but certainly have a lot of boosters, a lot of backers, and contribute a lot to the economy of the state. So at some point, this is going to move from the sports pages to sort of the political pages. And what does this mean for the economics of a state that relies on these colleges so dramatically?
Yeah, and I feel Berger was sending a pretty clear message to leadership at some of these schools to, hey, stick with the ACC. Do not rush off and try to get invited to the SEC, any other conference. And maybe the threat of saddling the two schools together is enough to do that. Because it's probably unlikely that a big major conference is going to want to pick multiple North Carolina schools. They'd be happy to get one, so you get all the media markets here and that extra TV money. But once you get one, you've got all those markets. You don't need another one.
And don't forget, these comments come after the Republican-appointed Board of Governors made it much more difficult for schools to change athletic conferences. Basically, the Board of Governors and the system president now have a veto on schools that want to change conferences. So many changes are coming to college athletics. I think part of what Berger was saying is let's slow down, let's see what happens, and make the right decision as opposed to what he called rash decisions. But at some point, someone may come to the legislature and say, we're leaving tens of millions of dollars on the table and we can no longer compete. What are you going to do about it? And so this is it's just an issue to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a huge issue over the next few years. Continue to grow in
hopefully that will keep me writing about it many years from now.
Yes. It's not just the legislature happening in state politics. We also have the runoff going in the runoff primaries for a few GOP races that couldn't get handled in the original primary back in March. Our partners at PolitiFact North Carolina just had I thought a pretty interesting fact check on the NC-13 race, which is the congressional district. It's kind of right around the triangle here. Parts of Wake County, all of Johnston County, and some of the other counties in our area. Kelly Daughtry and Brad Knott are the two candidates in that. They're both kind of wealthy Raleigh area attorneys who were competing for the seat, and whichever one of them wins is almost certainly going to go to Congress. There is a Democratic candidate, but this is a heavily, heavily Republican-leaning district, so this runoff primary is probably going to determine who the next member of Congress is. Kelly Daughtry had hit Brad Knott over his ties to Joe Biden. PolitiFact looked into that and found it false. So for people who are interested in reading more about this race, definitely go and check out that fact check by our colleague Andy Spey. I thought that was a really interesting one.
And they are basically, the entire campaign is about who is the true conservative, and so they're using any bits. Lots of Kelly Daughtry's history of past giving, Brad Knott's history of working in for the Justice Department as federal prosecutor under a Biden administration. How tenuous those claims are. I mean, the entire race is sort of focused on who's the most conservative among Kelly Daughtry or who's the true conservative among Kelly Daughtry and Brad Knott.
Yes, it is heading in a very negative direction here as the runoff approaches, and probably turnout is going to be very low. So, if you live in this district, your vote matters.
Yeah, you could not have voted in the Democratic primary. Right. So you must be a registered Republican or registered unaffiliated who did not vote in the Democratic primary in March. If you meet those categories, you're eligible to vote in this runoff.
Yeah, and I believe that describes a few 100,000 people out there. So, we might have a tiny fraction of that actually show up to vote. So if you would like to make your voice known, definitely read up more on that race. Out east in Greenville on Friday, there was a huge economic development announcement that Governor Cooper made, 900 new jobs there in Pitt County for a solar panel manufacturing company. It's kind of the latest in this trend that Cooper has been pushing North Carolina to go in and investing in clean energy manufacturing. For years, North Carolina was a textile manufacturing state, and then NAFTA happened, all those jobs move overseas. There's been this effort to figure out, okay, how do we replace that? How do we bring some, middle-class, blue-collar manufacturing jobs back to the state? And the state has spent literally billions of dollars on taxpayer incentives bringing in kind of clean energy companies. And the goal is that, okay, you focus on this one sector and it kind of builds off of that. There's, the supply chain, is all synergized and, all these nice words that you learn in business school. But there's the huge Toyota battery plant that's coming in, VinFast, the electric car makers in Chatham County. And then there's been, a handful of smaller companies. And this is definitely on the bigger side. I mean, 900 jobs is nothing to sneeze at. I think that's going to be really good news for the Greenville economy should that pan out. And
that's sort of how RTP, right? You got a bunch of companies that had a lot of biotech manufacturing, and then they started to build on themselves. I mean, the states also spend a lot on these mega sites to try to have land and have places where these businesses can come. I think it will be interesting at some point to have a deep dive into, has this worked? Has it actually been beneficial to the state? Certainly, we see these job announcements all the time, so that would indicate that it has worked. It has been beneficial. But I think you might find people on kind of both sides of the aisle who say have some quibbles with it.
Yes, you definitely have on both the left and the right some concerns with using government money to essentially bribe companies to move to North Carolina. But every other state does it. It's right. Kind of it's just an arms race. A lot of people even who support it will say, look, in a perfect world, no, we would not be paying these companies to move here. But South Carolina will, Tennessee will, Virginia will, Texas will, California will.
Right.
So you got to do it. One last thing. I was watching NBC National News the other night with Lester Holt, and who do I see but State Treasurer Dale Folwell. And he is on there talking about this push that, we've been writing about for months in the state health plan to end coverage for Wegovy and these other weight loss drugs. There were only 25,000, somewhere in that range, number of people on the state health plan who had these jobs. And that's out of 750,000 people. So only a small fraction. But it was going to cause premiums for a whole lot of people on that plan to double because these drugs are so expensive. And now you have Bernie Sanders, of all people, looking into this. And for people who don't know Dale Folwell here in North Carolina, he just recently ran in the Republican primary for governor. He has long been known as one of the most conservative Republicans in North Carolina politics. So it is interesting to see, him and, Democratic Socialist Bernie Sanders of Vermont on the same side on this issue. But, they're really kind of pushing the big pharma industry on the cost of these drugs, which are so expensive, but really in demand here in North Carolina and across the nation.
Yeah, in some ways, they're billed as diabetic drugs, and they'll still be available for people who have diabetes. But I guess the pharmaceutical industry has discovered that they also work as weight loss drugs or at least appetite suppressants in many ways. And you hear about Ozempic and Wegovy and many of these other ones. What fascinates me about this issue, and I'm not as well versed in it as you, is the fact that the state health plan, it impacts so many people. And so you're having to make decisions based on trying to keep those premiums down, but you also want to keep people on the state health plan healthy so that their premiums are not going up for other reasons. And so it's a real big balancing act between, these miracle drugs as they've been billed are out there, and they may keep people healthy in the long term. They may also make people much sicker in the long term. We haven't been using these drugs long enough to really make those determinations.
Right. Or, flip side, even if they do create huge costs right now, if they make people more fit, then that leads, to long-term huge savings for the state. And, I should note the vote to end coverage of this was pretty controversial when it happened. It was a 4-3 vote, so pretty narrow margins here by the state health plan. But, that is going forward. And, I should note both sides say they're negotiating with each other, both the state and like Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly, these drug companies who make these drugs. But so far, both sides are very angry at one another in all of the public statements that they send us whenever we write about it, and accuse the others of operating in bad faith and making terrible decisions. And so I don't know that those negotiations are going very well, but they are ongoing. So we will wait and see. Maybe they will, after they're done with their war of words, will actually settle on something that both sides can be okay with, and state employees will be able to access those drugs again.
That's a good primer for what we're about to face now for the next couple months here at the legislature. Lots of heated rhetoric. Maybe when it's all said and done, the two sides can agree to something that ends up helping North Carolinians.
Yep. Well, stay tuned here on The Wrap. We will continue talking about it, and you can find more podcasts from WRAL News at WRAL.com. Search for podcast. From sports to true crime, there are plenty of shows to keep you informed and entertained. Thank you for listening. I am Will Doran, and I'm here with Brian Murphy. We appreciate it.